In the last lecture, I introduced Romanticism, or the Romantic era of American literature. And I mentioned that Romanticism as an entire movement has these sub-movements that are built inside it, like Transcendentalism and the Gothic. We're going to talk today about what's called Dark Romanticism. Sometimes it's conflated with the Gothic. It has a lot in common with the Gothic, but the text that we're discussing today is not a Gothic text. That text is the excerpts of the novel Moby-Dick that is printed in the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume B, in the 10th edition. This is not a text that explores traditional Gothic themes, but it is a text that explores the dark side of human nature and the sort of terror and awe of a man against nature, which was a common theme that the Romantics were drawn to. Moby-Dick is published by Herman Melville in 1851. It's not his first novel, but clearly it's a novel that he hopes is going to make his literary reputation. It doesn't have that effect. Melville and Moby-Dick, like so many artists who came before and even after, it's a text that did not receive appreciation in Melville's own time. There are a variety of reasons why that might be, and I wish we had the opportunity to spend multiple weeks and class sessions reading the entirety of Moby-Dick together. In an accelerated course like this, we don't have the time to read the entirety of the text, but I think it's a really important text. And what Melville is doing with his characters is so wonderfully emblematic of the sort of dark romantic aesthetic and approach that it's something that I really wanted to talk about with you and at least familiarize you with Melville's style of writing and some of the more famous passages and characters. You might already know about Moby-Dick before you even read any of it. It has a reputation for the great American novel. As I mentioned, it's not appreciated in its own time, but it is appreciated in the early part of the 20th century, particularly as literary critics at that time appreciated for the first time the deeper psychological currents, the more experimental elements that are happening inside the novel, the sorts of things that might have turned readers and critics off in Melville's own time, are things that later become valued by the literary community in the 20th century. It's really discovered first in England, and then later rediscovered in America. And Americans at this time, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, are looking to try to show that American literature is something worth studying as a field. It might surprise you to know that in the early part of the 20th century, American literature was not a field that was really studied. If you were going to study literature in school, the odds were very good, if you spoke English, that you were going to be reading British literature. And American literature was not really considered intellectual enough or artistic enough to be worthy of study. So a lot of writers and thinkers and critics in the early part of the 20th century are trying to make the case that American literature is a field that's really worth studying. Within our course site, I talk a little bit about F.O. Matheson and his book on the American Renaissance that comes out in 1941. It's a landmark text that really, raises up American literature as a field that's worth studying. And in the context on American Romanticism, I talked a bit about the shortcomings in Matheson's work, right? He's really focused primarily on male writers, white male writers. He ignores the contributions of women writers at the time. He ignores the contributions of non-white writers, figures like Frederick Douglass and many other engaging, thoughtful, powerful writers during this time. And He focuses primarily on Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne and Melville and Whitman, and leaves Poe out of it. And so as writers like that, we're trying to say, look, American literature does really interesting, very psychologically complex things. One of the texts that they turn to prove that point is Moby-Dick, which was published in 1851. It's published right around the same time as The Scarlet Letter. These are not the first American novels, but I think from a sense of history, looking back on contenders for the title Great American Novel, Moby-Dick and Scarlet Letter are two of the earliest contenders for that title. Your Norton Anthology does a pretty good job of excerpting some key chapters from Moby-Dick, and uploaded onto our course site is a full summary of the novel if you'd like to contextualize some of these chapters within that full summary. But since we are going to primarily focus on Melville's language, and specifically Captain Ahab as a character, for the purposes of what is in the Norton Anthology, that really covers things particularly well. But before we get to that, let's talk about what Dark Romanticism is and how we should distinguish it from other ideas within the Romantic tradition. Texts that fall under the title of Dark Romanticism are fascinated with the irrational. They're fascinated with the human mind run amok. Themes of human fallibility really play into dark romantic texts. Themes of self-destruction feature into these texts. Punishment and the psychological effects of guilt are also explored in dark romantic texts. The major insight of the dark romantic sort of subgenre within the romantic movement is that the conscious mind is not always in control. This is important for us to emphasize because it stands in contrast to the Enlightenment. Remember that the Enlightenment values objectivity and reason and logic and things working from a place of philosophical principles, arguments and ideas that can be mapped out. The Enlightenment embraces the idea of the mind as a way to sort of differentiate what it's trying to do from the earlier movements, particularly Puritanism, which is an embrace of the heart and faith. And the Enlightenment thinks that we can understand the world. It overlaps with the scientific revolution. It has to do with huge advances coming in fields like physics with Isaac Newton, political science with figures like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with philosophy like Immanuel Kant and his first principles and deontological approach to ethics. It's coming in the fields of astronomy after figures like Galileo and Copernicus, who are literally changing the way we understand the world. It puts the human mind front and center. And many romantic writers were quick to say, well, hold on just a second here. Consciousness, rationality, that might be the ideal, but that's not all the mind does. For example, who's in control of your mind when you are sleeping? When you are sleeping and dreaming, wild off-the-wall dreams or nightmares, who is in control of your mind at that time? Can it really be said to be you? Or is your mind doing something that's outside of your control? How do we explain mental illness? People who, through no fault of their own, experience schizophrenia or severe clinical depression. How do we explain mental illness in the concept of the Enlightenment, with the mind being front and center and in control? Now, I don't mean scientifically how do we explain mental illness. We know, years on, the ways in which brain damage can cause changes to mood and behavior and personality. We know now genetic causes linked with mental illness. We know how best to address mental illness. But at the time that the Romantic period is happening, that's not necessarily clear. And we're raising key questions of what happens when the mind goes off the rails. In other words, if we're betting everything, right, on consciousness and the human mind is capable of rising to the high heights promised by the Enlightenment, what happens if human beings are cruel? What happens if we temporarily lose sanity? What happens when we dream? What if the human mind, in other words, is not an object of perfection, but a flawed object? The Dark Romantics are interested in mystery, and they're interested in awe, they're interested in danger and unease, and people being led down darker paths, either of their own doing or forces that are leading them that way. This sounds like it has a lot in common with the Gothic, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture video, but it's not quite the Gothic. So we're making a distinction here between Dark Romanticism and the Gothic. We're trying not to conflate the two things, though they're going to have a lot in common with each other. What I want to do is I want to take a look at some of the characters and ideas that are introduced within the text Moby-Dick. And we're in the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume B. We're going to start at the beginning of Moby-Dick, the excerpts that are given to us, and it's on page 1279. So the novel Moby-Dick has probably one of the most famous opening sentences in all of American literature. Even if you've never read Moby-Dick, you might be familiar with it. It's famous enough that it begins to pop up in pop culture, and there are parodies of it and those sorts of things, which I think is a testament to how deeply the text is entrenched in our culture. Even the idea of the white whale, the white whale being the thing that you are pursuing at all costs, is a reflection back in Moby-Dick, a novel about whaling and people going to sea and the adventures or misadventures that happen when they're there. So here's the opening lines of the novel Moby-Dick. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There's nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, sometime or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings toward the ocean with me. And then he proceeds to talk about how people are sort of drawn to the water, right? But think about what is being introduced in the opening lines of this novel. Our narrator says to call him Ishmael, right? Which we have no choice to do because otherwise he doesn't have a name. But he doesn't say my name is Ishmael. He says call me Ishmael. The footnote here reminds you that Ishmael is an outcast. He's the son Abraham has in the book of Genesis, who's not the rightful heir to the covenant that God and Abraham strike together. He's an outsider, a wild person, someone who's wronged, who's sort of cast out from society. Right? That is who our narrator is evoking in the first three words of the novel, right? Call me Ishmael. Telling us right up front, he's an outcast, he's an outsider, he's not part of the mainstream. He tells us that he wants to see the watery part of the world. He goes on ships as a crew member. He doesn't go as a passenger because he doesn't have the money to do so. So he signs up for ships as a worker. And in this novel, he's going to sign up for a whaling ship going out of Nantucket in Massachusetts as a worker and as a member of a whaling ship. He tells us that this is part of the way that he has of driving off his darker feelings, his depression, his mental problems. He describes this as the damp, drizzly November in his soul. When he talks about involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses, right? His mind is attuned to death. Whenever his anxieties or his depression seem to get the best of him, he wants to set off on a ship, right? Give himself something to do. Give himself something to distract from his current troubles. He evokes the historical figure of Cato. Cato was a Roman statesman who was opposed to the rise of Julius Caesar. And Cato famously chose to commit suicide over putting himself in subservience to Caesar, right? He says, going out on the boat, this is the substitute for pistol and ball. In other words, for a gun. Cato throws himself on a sword, but our narrator takes to the ship. So from the opening lines of the novel, we have a sense here of the darker parts of human psychology. Characters who aren't quite in control of themselves, who are at the mercy of their darker psychologies. Ishmael's imagination can run away with him. In fact, he spends a lot of the novel, Moby-Dick, reflecting philosophically. In the context that I gave you on American Romanticism, I describe it as a philosophical novel. There are many chapters where Ishmael sort of digresses and finds himself waxing poetic or waxing philosophical about certain ideas, of staring at a whale and considering how the fact that the whale's eyes are on the side of the head changes the way that it perceives the world. And does that mean it has more perception of the world than people do, or does it have less perception of the world than people do? So the text itself really moves throughout. It's got this overarching narrative of Ishmael and a harpooner named Queequeg signing up to take a ship called the Pequod under the supervision and captaining of Ahab out to find whales around the Atlantic and the Pacific. But along the way, it gives Ishmael plenty of time to sort of reflect on the human condition, to reflect on whaling in general, to reflect on the broad culture. You get a sense of his ability to be retrospective and reflective at the start of the excerpt from chapter 3, The Spouter Inn. He tells us, on page 1283, entering that gable-ended Spouter Inn, you find yourself in a wide, low, straggling entry with old-fashioned wainscots, reminding one of the bulwarks of some condemned old craft. On one side hung a very large oil painting, so thoroughly besmoked and every way defaced that in the unequal cross-lights by which you viewed it, it was only by diligent study and a series of systematic visits to it and careful inquiry of the neighbors that you could anyway arrive at an understanding of its purpose. Such unaccountable masses of shades and shadows that at first you almost thought some ambitious young artist in the time of the New England hags had endeavored to delineate chaos, bewitched. But by dint of much and earnest contemplation and oft-repeated ponderings, and especially by throwing open the little window towards the back of the entry, you at last came to the conclusion that such an idea, however wild, might not be altogether unwarranted. But what most puzzled and confounded you was a long, limber, portentous black mass of something hovering in the center of the picture over 3 blue, dim, perpendicular lines floating in a nameless yeast. A boggy, soggy, squitchy picture, truly, enough to drive a nervous man distracted. Yet was there a sort of indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity about it that fairly froze you to it, till you involuntarily took an oath with yourself to find out what that marvelous painting meant. And he talks about how he thinks the painting, in the next paragraph, right? His final theory that he puts forward for what the painting is, based partly on the aggregated opinions of the many aged persons with whom I conversed upon the subject. The picture represents a Cape Horner in a great hurricane. The half-foundered ship weltering there with its 3 dismantled masts alone visible, and an exasperated whale purposing to spring clean over the craft is in the enormous act of impaling himself upon the 3 mastheads. So there's a bit of foreshadowing here, but also it's not exact foreshadowing, but there is an idea. He sees the painting and sees in it an act of self-destruction. People engaging in dangerous behavior, and there's a mystery in the way that the painting is presented. By the way, just, not for nothing, the literary device that's being used here is called ekphrasis. It's when a writer spends a lot of time describing a work of art, a visual work of art, right? We don't get to see what the painting looks like, but yet we have long passage describing the painting. And anytime a writer is bringing something like that into a text, I think we have the right, it's responsible of us to slow down and ask, what might the purpose of this be? And I think there are a number of possible purposes to this, both the sort of inscrutability and mysteriousness of the world, both a sense in which Ishmael sees in the painting a whaling trip gone wrong, which provides a little bit of foreshadowing for what's going to come in the novel. Also a sense of what he sees as very negative and reflects his own mental state without Melville needing to tell us exactly what Ishmael is thinking or feeling at that moment. It's all of these things kind of all wrapped up in one. In the excerpt from chapter 3, we meet Queequeg. And he's a Pacific Islander who is working on whaling ships and has sort of found his way into New England from the work that he's done. Chapter 3 makes a big deal out of this idea of the cannibal. And the stereotype here is that a Pacific Islander or on Pacific Islands, perhaps, the people get engaged in cannibalism. Partly this is a reflection of the West, Europe and America, getting out and exploring the Pacific. Not the first time that this has happened, but tales of far-flung adventures into the Pacific, and also of meeting strange cultures and the dangers that exist when individuals meet up in strange cultures. And certainly the stereotype is not 100% unfounded, but there's a lot of anxiety here about the threats and the danger of the Pacific. And Queequeg sort of represents a lot of these anxieties wrapped up in one person. Ishmael finds himself bunking with Queequeg because there's no other bed in the inn, and eventually develops a great respect for Queequeg, who's very good at what he does, and together Queequeg and Ishmael go out on the ship together. They are shipmates, and Queequeg's a very talented harpooner. Some of the emphasis on fears of cannibalism, it can be traced back to an actual event that in some ways inspired the novel Moby-Dick. So I talk about this in the context, but I want to read you that portion of the context for your knowledge and understanding as well. So Melville's own experience on a whaling ship served as an inspiration for Moby-Dick, but elements of the novel can actually be traced back to two factual instances. The first is an article that's published in May of 1839 called Moby-Dick, or White Whale of the Pacific. It recounts the capture of a giant white whale that had become famous among whalers for its violent attacks on the ships. So this is in the novel. Moby-Dick is a sperm whale, one of the largest and also aggressive whales that are out there, and he's this large white, or really sort of a speckled or striped sperm whale that looks white in the water. The meaning itself, the name Moby-Dick, comes from the fact that he was encountered off of an island called Mocha, and also Dick is just kind of like a generic male name, right? So if you've ever wanted to know why he's called Moby-Dick, it's just in that sense of like every Tom, Dick, and Harry, kind of as the saying kind of goes. It's just a generic place filler male name. The other incident that plays a role here is the tragedy of a ship that's called the Essex. It was a whaling ship that had also set out from Nantucket, just as the Pequod does in the novel, and it gets attacked and it gets sunk by a sperm whale in 1820. So this event happens before the article with Moby-Dick gets published and serves as an inspiration to the novel. They're off the coast of South America, and it's ironic and tragic at the same time. The story draws a lot of attention. Nowadays we would think of it as like a story that goes viral or a clickbait story, or previously like something that would have shown up in gossip newspapers or tabloids, or have been talked about on television, sensationalized stories and headlines. But the sinking of the Essex by this whale draws attention because the men who survived eventually had to do so by engaging in cannibalism and drawing lots to determine who would be killed, so that the others would be able to stay alive. The irony that I mentioned, the tragic irony of the situation, really, is that they stayed close to South America because they didn't want to head out for the Pacific Islands because they were afraid of encountering people who would be cannibals. Yet they ended up having to resort to cannibalism themselves in order to stay alive on their lifeboats while in the time that was necessary in order to get rescued. They were out and more than 3 months and facing dehydration and starvation in the open ocean. Okay, so we have the introduction of Queequeg in chapter 3, and there's some like kind of outrageous humor that's happening, and then Ishmael is scared and he's engaging in some stereotypes, so on and so forth. The excerpt in the book jumps forward to chapter 28, which is where we get the introduction of Captain Ahab. Ahab is a fascinating and remarkable literary figure in a number of ways. He's famous for his peg leg, as it's called. He's missing a portion of his leg, and he has a prosthetic that's made out of whale bone that helps him walk. He lost his leg to Moby-Dick in the last encounter that he had with Moby-Dick. And when we are introduced to Ahab, even then later we have a description of Ahab, but we don't really get, we don't hear what's driving Ahab until chapter 36. So turn to page 1297 with me, and I want to take a look at an exchange that happens between Ahab and the first mate, whose name is Starbuck. About a third of the way down the page, Ahab speaks. And by the way, I'm just going to tell you right now, I can't do a really good Ahab voice, and so without probably laughing at myself. So I'm just going to try to read the text as straightforwardly as possible. But if I slip into what almost sounds like a pirate voice, just please forgive me. All ye mastheaders have before now heard me give orders about a white whale, Ahab says. Look ye, do you see this Spanish ounce of gold? Holding up a broad, bright coin in the sun. It is a $16 piece, men. Do you see it? Mr. Starbuck, hand me yon top maul. While the mate was getting the hammer, Ahab, without speaking, was slowly rubbing the gold piece against the skirts of his jacket, as if to heighten its luster, and without using any words was meanwhile lowly humming to himself, producing a sound so strangely muffled and inarticulate that it seemed the mechanical humming of the wheels of his vitality in him. Receiving the top maul from Starbuck, he advanced towards the main mast with the hammer uplifted in one hand, exhibiting the gold with the other, and with a high raised voice exclaiming, "Whosoever of ye raises me a white-headed whale with a wrinkled brow and a crooked jaw, whosoever of ye raises me that white-headed whale with 3 holes punctured in his starboard fluke, look ye, whosoever of ye raises me that same white whale, he shall have this gold ounce." my boys. The crew screams, huzzah, huzzah. It's a white whale, I say, resumed Ahab, as he threw down the top maul. A white whale. Skin your eyes for him, men. Look sharp for white water. If ye see but a bubble, sing out. One of the men on the ship, Tashtego, asks, Captain Ahab, said Tashtego, that white whale must be the same that some call Moby-Dick. Moby-Dick, shouted Ahab. Do ye know the white whale then, Tash? Does he fantail a little curious, sir, before he goes down, said the gay header deliberately. And he has a curious spout, too, says Dagu, very bushy even for a Parmacetti, and mighty quick, Captain Ahab. Ahab responds enthusiastically, and this is the moment when Starbuck, the first mate, pushes back awkwardly against Ahab. He says, about a third or a quarter of the way down 1298, Captain Ahab, I have heard of Moby-Dick, but it was not Moby-Dick that took off thy leg. Who told ye that? Cried Ahab, then pausing. I, Starbuck, I, my hearties all round. It was Moby-Dick that dismasted me. Moby-Dick that brought me to this dead stump I stand on now. I, he shouted with a terrific, loud, animal sob, like that of a heart-stricken moose. I, it was that accursed white whale that raised me, made me a poor pegging lubber of me forever and a day. Then tossing both arms with measureless imprecations, he shouted out, I, and I'll chase him round Good Hope, and round the Horn, and round the Norway Maelstrom, and round perdition's flames before I give him up. And this is what ye have shipped for, men, to chase that white whale on both sides of land, and over all sides of earth, till he spouts black blood and rolls fin out. What say ye, men? Will ye splice hands on it now? I think ye do look brave. Then he asks Starbuck, what's this long face about, Mr. Starbuck? Wilt thou not chase the white whale? Art not game for Moby-Dick? I am game for his crooked jaw, and for the jaws of death too, Captain Ahab, if it fairly comes in the way of the business we follow. But I came to hunt whales, not my commander's vengeance. How many barrels will thy vengeance yield thee, even if thou gettest it, Captain Ahab? It will not fetch thee much in our Nantucket market. Ahab responds explosively to Starbuck's concern. Starbuck's concern is, look, I signed up to be on this whaling ship because I want to hunt whales. I didn't sign up to hunt down one whale in order for you to exact your vengeance on the whale. And when he asks, how many barrels will thy vengeance yield thee? It will not fetch thee much in our Nantucket market. What he's referring to is that the ship members, the amount of money that they're going to get paid at the end of their whaling voyage will depend on how much blubber, how many whales they actually catch. And they're able to melt down the fat in order to turn into oil, in order to sell at market. Whale oil was used for fuel in candles and a number of different household uses at the time. It was a prolific business and prosperous too. And people who were on the ship are given shares of the total haul that they bring back. And so Starbuck is concerned that by focusing exclusively on Moby-Dick, Ahab is not going to return to shore with much product to sell. And therefore, all of this work that the men on the boat are going to put into it, they're not going to get enough out of it to have made it worth their while. That's the question or the opposition that Starbuck poses to Ahab at this moment. And Ahab's response is, Nantucket market hoot, but come closer, Starbuck. Thou requirest a little lower layer. If money's to be the measurer, man, and the accountants have computed their great counting house, the globe, by girdling it with guineas, 1 to every 3 parts an inch, then let me tell thee that my vengeance will fetch a great premium here. And Starbuck responds at the top of page 1299, vengeance on a dumb brute that simply smote thee from blindest instinct, madness. To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, seems blasphemous. But Ahab rallies the crew and Starbuck goes along with it. And it's clear Melville is interested here in the sort of blind terror, irrationality, self-destruction. Well, the word he uses to describe Ahab in a later chapter is monomania, right? Obsessively focused on one thing. To his own, as we know by the end of the excerpt, his own self-destruction. He manages to harpoon Moby-Dick, but he gets caught up in the line that pulls him into the water and kills him as a result. His obsessive need for vengeance on what Starbuck calls a dumb brute, right? The whale attacked out of instinct, blind instinct. It didn't attack, it's not personal, right? The whale didn't attack you personally, Ahab. It's reacting on instinct. It's madness, Starbuck says. Right? Starbuck's got a little bit of that Enlightenment quality about him, right? He's wary of the whole thing, but he ultimately doesn't have a choice except to go along with it. He signed up, as did everyone else on the ship. They signed up to go whaling, to catch whales, to come back and sell what they get, and to make money that way. It's only after they're out to sea that Ahab finally reveals not just his personal motivations, but reveals himself. He spends a lot of time hidden away in the captain's chambers of the ship. And it's only after they're out to sea that Ahab emerges and reveals what's really going on. But everybody is in on it with the vengeance as well, and Ahab gets his way, and the ship moves in pursuit of Moby-Dick. Now, Ishmael wonders in the text if partly what's happening is that Ahab was driven mad in the pain and the agony after he lost his leg. Because he loses the leg while at sea, and he's not able to be treated for it and really able to convalesce on it until he gets back. The ship still needs to sail back to Nantucket. So Ishmael is concerned about this, and on page 1305 he reflects on his fear or his his observations of Ahab's madness. About halfway down the page on 1305. Ahab had cherished a wild vindictiveness against the whale. All the more fell for it in that his frantic morbidness, he at least came to identify with him. Not only all his bodily woes, but all his intellectual and spiritual exasperations. The white whale swam before him as the monomaniac incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them, till they are left living on with half a heart and half a lung. That intangible malignity which has been from the beginning, to whose dominion ever the modern Christians ascribe one half of the world's, with the ancient Ophites of the East reverenced in their statue devil, Ahab did not fall down and worship it like them, but deliriously transferring its idea to the abhorred white whale, he pitted himself, all mutilated, against it. All that most maddens and torments, all that stirs up the lees of things, all truth with malice in it, all that cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil to crazy Ahab were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby-Dick. He piled up the whale's white hump. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down. And then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it. And this is where Ahab, this is where Ishmael sort of hypothesizes where Ahab's badness comes from at the bottom of the page, about 4 lines up. By this collision, forced to turn towards home, and for long months of days and weeks, Ahab and anguish lay stretched together in one hammock, round in midwinter that dreary, howling Patagonian cape. Then it was that his torn body and gashed soul bled into one another, so interfusing made him mad. That it was only then, on the homeward voyage, after the encounter, that the final monomania seized him, seems all but certain from the fact that, at intervals during the passage, he was a raving lunatic. And though unlimbed of a leg, yet such vital strength yet lurked in his Egyptian chest, and was moreover intensified by his delirium that his mates were forced to lace him fast, even there as he sailed, raving in his hammock. In a straitjacket, he swung to the mad rockings of the gales. And when running into more sufferable latitudes, the ship, with mid-sunsail spread, floated across the tranquil tropics, and to all appearances the old man's delirium seemed left behind him with the Cape Horn swells, and he came forth from his dark den into the blessed light and air. Even then, when he bore that firm, collected front, however pale, and issued his calm orders once again, and his mates thanked God the direful madness was now gone, even then Ahab, in his hidden self, raved on. Human madness is oftentimes a cunning and most feline thing. When you think it fled, it may have but become transfigured into some still subtler form. Ahab's full lunacy subsided not, but deepeningly contracted, like the unabated Hudson, when the noble Northman flows narrowly but unfathomably through the Highland Gorge. As I mentioned, Ahab's ending is not happy. He's taken down by the ropes of his own harpoon and dies at sea. Moby-Dick succeeds in destroying the ship, as well as the boats that are used in hunting the whales, going out and engaging in the harpooning and exhausting the whales. The Pequod sinks in a sort of vortex in the ocean, which sort of sucks down everything with it, and Moby-Dick escapes after this to terrorize future whaling ships and drive future captains mad, no doubt. In the epilogue, we learn that Ishmael survives all of this because he's out on the edge of the action when the ship goes down. He's too far away for the ship to suck him down into the water as well. And he ends up surviving on Queequeg's coffin, which is used in the text. It has a metaphoric use throughout as this coffin that Queequeg decorates when he thinks he's going to die, and he survives, but eventually the coffin turns into a sort of lifeboat for Ishmael, and Ishmael is picked up by another ship called the Rachel that the Pequod had previously run into. And the captain of the Rachel is looking for his lost son, and Ahab refuses to help because he's so focused on finding Moby-Dick. It's a terrific story and a wild, wild book. It's a pretty long book. It's got 130 some chapters to it, but the chapters are usually quite short. And if you ever have an opportunity in your time to read the entirety of Moby-Dick or listen to it on an audiobook or anything like that, I so strongly recommend it. It's a great example of the darker side of human nature and great exemplary text of sort of the dark romantic ideas. Ahab obsessively focused on catching this whale, and in doing so brings almost everyone to tragedy with him. It's a man versus nature story, the uncontrollable whale, sort of a hauntingly white whale that Ishmael finds horrifying and projects fear onto and disgust onto, and everyone is kind of trapped in this, and the ghostly apparition of Moby-Dick echoes throughout the work. There are legends that he's able to be everywhere at once, and that he's conscious, and he hunts down ships and destroys them. He holds a grudge as well. It's a fascinating text and does a lot of really interesting things inside it. I wish we had the time to read the entirety of it in this course, but I strongly recommend it to you. Our next text, or our next topic of discussion is going to be the American Gothic. We'll be taking a look at a short story from Nathaniel Hawthorne and a short story from Edgar Allan Poe.